This is your macroeconomics video on the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve is just another curve that it shows us in a slightly different way how to see the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. We can also see this on our aggregate supply and demand graph. So the Phillips curve in the short run shows a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. On your aggregate supply curve, your short-run aggregate supply line, they show the relationship between inflation, or what we call price level, which is your vertical axis, and then the horizontal axis is related to employment, because remember, as GDP rises, employment rises. So the Phillips curve is just flipping that horizontal axis to be unemployment instead of employment. So if you suppose that your CPI or price level is at 100 this year, then there's two possible situations that can happen for next year. Price levels can either go up or go down. So if aggregate demand is really low, then you might see a small increase in price level, which means low inflation. That also means we have low output or real GDP, but we can have high unemployment. And because if we're not producing output or real GDP, then businesses don't need workers to do that. So the unemployment rate would rise. If aggregate demand is high, then we see big increases in price level, or we have high inflation. This also leads to more output as real GDP rises. And of course, in order to produce those goods, we employ people. So unemployment is lower. So here's what this looks like. On the left-hand side, we have your short-run supply line. The vertical axis is price level, which is the exact same thing as inflation or CPI. The horizontal axis here is real GDP, which we denote with a Y. That is also equated to employment. So the Phillips curve I have set up over here on the right has inflation on the vertical axis, and the horizontal is just unemployment rate. So we have flipped it to make it get the opposite of what the horizontal axis is on our aggregate supply and demand line. So if we have our short-run supply line, and let's just put in an aggregate demand line here, and let's say that at this level, price levels or CPI went up to 103%, or 103, which means it's 3% above the base year, and we're at a real GDP of Y1. If we do that over here on our Phillips curve, we're typically on our axes, we use percentages on the Phillips curve. So this would be an inflation rate of 3%. Let's say Y1 equates to a 6% unemployment rate. Now, if aggregate demand rises, price levels, of course, would rise. We'll say to 105 CPI, and your output would go up, or your unemployment would go down. So if we put our inflation up to 5% and unemployment went down to 4%, we now have a downward sloping Phillips curve. This short-run Phillips curve is downward sloping, but it is the same line as your short-run aggregate supply line. Because we'd made the vertical axis the opposite, we made it unemployment, where your aggregate graph was employment, this changes it to a negative relationship as opposed to a positive one.